to rezone the site, which is to my left, to build 127 market condos and only 25 seniors housing units. The coalition of youth organizations that came together today oppose this rezoning application. We also want to discuss and build a common vision for this site that would best serve the needs of Chinatown. To be clear, we don't oppose all development in Chinatown, but we do believe that all development must address the needs of seniors and low-income housing in the community while preserving Chinatown's heritage.
Chinatown was an amazing place to grow up in, especially during the formative years when all of a sudden you were old enough to go out wandering on your own, your parents let you do it. You can go by restaurants and the barbecue shops and see all the meats being prepared. I wouldn't have traded that experience for anything else.
My late grandfather would take me to Hong Kong cafes and get lobster congee for me, because he knew all the people who worked there, and I had no idea how lucky I was. It's really special to know that organizing in a neighborhood like Chinatown means that you're directly connected to your ancestors, which is something that I've struggled to find, and is something that I really yearn for.
I remember, when I was young, living in the Britannia area and walking just what seemed like forever. In fact, my grandfather would have to pick me up and carry me, always the last few blocks because I was so tired. So this is as a 3-year-old, 4-year-old. But I remember coming and just seeing all these old men in cafes. He would walk in and they all would sort of like welcome him. I remember how joking and happy and teasing and mocking they were.
When I was really young, my grandparents used to bring me down to Chinatown all the time, and I would do what all Asian kids my age did. We would go to like a cha-chan-ping and have milk tea and some sort of bao. And so as a child, I had this very exoticized and I think romanticized view of Chinatown. It was where my grandparents had their community and where they got to see their friends, and it's where they did their grocery shopping, and it's where I got candy from the nice lady at the grocery store. And so I've always had this very fond memory of Chinatown.
My parents came in the 70s. We don't have a long history like many other Chinese Canadians in Chinatown, but Chinatown is definitely a place where we have a sense of belonging, where I can practice my Cantonese language, where I feel welcome. And that sense of belonging and community and connection, that cultural richness as people of color.
It's that shared connection that so many people have with their heritage. I think people go to Richmond, they go to Burnaby, but something always draws them back to Chinatown. There's only one Chinatown. Like, people like to ask, is Richmond the new Chinatown? Yeah, but you're still referencing the original, right? That's where our shared cultural heritage lies. It's the heart and soul of the Chinese community.
Chinatown felt like home, like from the beginning. It had something, like something hard to explain, but a sense of familiarity. I felt at ease in the neighborhood.
So growing up in Chinatown during the heydays, 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was bright, it was vibrant. I think the fondest memories that I have of Chinatown are literally eating at any one of the many restaurants down there in a family occasion or meeting with friends. Almost everybody who grew up in Vancouver, Chinese and non-Chinese, has a memory of going to Chinatown.
Chinatown was always a bustling community. It was a mixture of low income, middle income, working people, wealthy people. It was the focus of the Chinese community within the Lower Mainland. If you wanted to buy Chinese products, you had to come to Chinatown. You wanted to speak to a Chinese lawyer, banker, doctor, you had to come to Chinatown. So it was a city within itself.
It's my roots. It's not just the neighborhood I grew up in and where my father worked. It was a place where I got to learn to speak Cantonese, and it was a place where I could feel safe. It was a place where I would take my 25 cents and go and buy a bowl of, wonton soup at one of the restaurants and know I'd be well looked after, even though I was only 8 years old or 10 years old. It was a community where we knew everybody, where our neighbors were our friends, and we shared a common experience. We often ate together. I got hand-me-down clothing from the neighbors because there wasn't a lot of money to go around, but we always ate well. And there was a lot of things about Chinatown which were quite special, and I'd like to see that come back.
One of the interesting things for me about Chinatown through the decades is that it was the ground zero of all the attempts to disenfranchise the Chinese, to exclude them from social life, exclude them from economic prosperity, exclude them spatially or physically or geographically. Chinatown, you could say, was this site that was itself the result of exclusion. It was the result of a community coming together and putting their shops and their associations and their social life together in one place because it was a safe space for them.
After the completion of the Trans-Canada Railroad, there's a lot of Chinese workers who actually made that project happen, but then they had nowhere to go. And so Chinatown was located on the outskirts of the city of Vancouver, and it's kind of a swampy district. And it is this sort of the physical legacy of that incredible sacrifice from an earlier generation who helped, build Canada. And so for me, it would be a shame if that, all of a sudden disappeared.
It's a neighborhood that's always been like a safe place for folks who haven't been able to go elsewhere. And it's always been a place that people have been put. But as much as that is its history, choosing to be there now, it means a lot to folks who have that kind of understanding and lived experience of that history.
Chinatown to me has always been this inclusive place that welcomes, all the misfits, I guess. I was very proud to learn about the history of Shaolin at Main and Union, the original building. It wasn't just Chinese people that were living there. Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Vietnamese, Indigenous, East Indian. And I've also learned that, Chinatown was actually the home for many Italians, Jewish, other types of immigrants were also stigmatized against. So they settled where they could and, they lived where they could, and that included Chinatown.
Grandfather had lived here almost his entire life. He had come here just before the head tax had been implemented in 1923. He came as a teenager. He returned home for just this one trip, got married, impregnated his new wife, and then left before my mom was born. And so this was in 1937. So like many men, because of exclusion, he couldn't bring his wife and family. And so my grandmother and mother, grew up in China. They had a split family, and this was very common for so many of the old-timers that were here. Finally, in the 1960s, he was able to bring my grandmother and my mother over, and so they came into Canada in 1965.
Chinatown has changed a lot over the years. It's gone from when I was a kid being a really busy, bustling, dynamic, fragrant, and smelly place to a place with many closed storefronts, which I find really sad. We used to have a lot of second-floor restaurants. They're not there anymore. And lots of fresh everything, from live chickens to lots of fresh produce and real diverse stores. On Pender Street, you'd have a section that was for the food that the Strathcona residents mostly wanted, and that was further east. And then the further west would be the dry goods, the clothing and the furnishings and the stores. But we were also not just a couple of blocks. We were on Keefer Street and Georgia Street and Union Street to the south, and on Hastings and Cordova to the north. And so it was a very large community. So today it's shrunk. The number of viable and successful businesses in Chinatown are fewer. They're struggling. It doesn't feel as alive as it used to be, with crowds on the street.
Chinatown has changed over the years in so many different ways, but in the modern era, really, if you take the Chinatown that really, I think most people would be familiar with in the 1960s, that Chinatown that really comes alive with the increased immigration, that awareness that Chinatown's kind of cool, the nightclub scene that was here, because that's one of the things that we forget, is that Chinatown was one of the nightclub districts for Vancouver. Forbidden City, Bamboo Terrace. These were not just restaurants, these were event places and music and show places. And so Vancouver was coming to Chinatown for its entertainment. By the time I moved here in the early 70s, the City of Vancouver passed its new sign bylaw. That meant large-scale neon signs that moved or spun or blinked or went above the roof, etc., were suddenly not allowed. And that's where we started to see a lot of that spectacular Vancouver landscape, the night landscape, disappear. And whenever you take light and color away from the street, you kill a street. And in so many meetings in Chinatown, what can we do for Chinatown? In the 90s, someone would always put up there, please bring back the neon signs, right? That idea of light, because it is the sense of place and the sense of activity actually hinges on something as ephemeral as the amount of light and color of light on the street. So that, I think, marks a perception of decline in the neighborhood. And it's interesting, when the ho-ho sign came down in the late 90s, that's when people really started talking about the future of Chinatown. Oh my God, what's happening to Chinatown? Because that marker, that iconic piece had come down.
You had a large influx of Chinese coming from Hong Kong in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. And because of that, they created satellite communities, which started with Richmond, Coquitlam, Victoria Drive, so that you no longer had to come to Chinatown to transact business in Chinese.
Deterioration, I think, happens slowly. And you don't even notice it. It's like little by little. And then there's kind of a tipping point when you say, wow, like what happened? But there's many merchants that had worked there for 25 years and just slowly closing up shop, deciding that it was just too difficult to operate in the neighborhood. And, it's heartbreaking. People spending their whole, careers in Chinatown to sort of have to leave because it was no longer a place that their customers wanted to come and visit.
Chinatown has evolved over its 130 years of history, and it's continuing to evolve. It's like the grocery stores and the old restaurants. Those have all disappeared because those were first-generation immigrant families that sent their kids to go to university, get an education, become a doctor, become a lawyer, get a profession. Because you don't want to be like us and work in the shop for 12 hours a day, and we can't go anywhere because we have to be in the shop. Those businesses aren't carrying on because at some point, grandmother, father has to retire, and the kids are off doing other things. And how can we keep our distinctiveness and still move forward, into the future?
One of my favorite barbecue shops, this is many years ago now, but the owner retired, and I stupidly said, "You retiring?" He goes, "Well, yeah." And I can't remember, I think it was 81 or something like that. And he says, "I want to go on a cruise." And, and he said, before he asked, the kid's a lawyer. So you have that generational shift where traditional businesses that we know and love are closing. Some are being forced out, some are just no one there to take over the business.
Over the last number of decades, it has deteriorated. There's no question about that, and nobody would deny that as well. While that's very sad, therein lies the opportunity. And that opportunity is to reinvent this new Chinatown.
The BIA led a push, and it culminated in the 2011 Historic Area Height Review, where it allowed higher, taller buildings in Chinatown. And it was part of a thinking that you need more people in Chinatown and consumers, active consumers in the neighborhood to allow the local businesses to survive.
If you think about Chinatown's roots, it was about overcoming adversity. It was about perseverance. And I think that when more and more people think about what does this little neighborhood represent, I've seen it sort of growing support from all sorts of people, whether or not Chinese and non-Chinese, and even people who are not necessarily even from Vancouver. And I can see a new generation of youth that are also interested in trying to save this neighborhood.
So the Coalition of Chinese Youth Organizations came together because we understand that this is a very important fight for our generation. We acknowledge that we come from a long history of activism within the Chinese Canadian community, and we are coming together with a desire to see Chinatown thrive, not only socially, economically, politically, but also culturally. We do want to make it loud and clear that we don't support this development.
So I first heard about 105 Keefer in the news. I think most people that there was this new development going up in Chinatown, and there'd already been a few newer condo builds. But what was different about 105 was, well, number one, its proximity to Chinatown Memorial Square, right? And also, I think the form factor of 105, and also what it could have been versus, market condominiums.
I had initially heard about it through friends, and at the time I didn't quite understand what it was, because I think, Vancouver, there's so many redevelopments and so many projects going on that it didn't really sink in the gravity of the situation. So it wasn't until I actually started hearing about it in the news that I was oh, there's more to this.
The development had been floated in advocacy circles because the gas station that occupied the site was sort of like one of those unicorns. Like, how come no one has bought the station? How come this thing still stands up? Given the size of the site, how is this not a development site? And many, many, many folks have tried to buy the station. So that was news. Oh, the station's sold. What's coming? So people were already ears prickly, and let's find out what's going on.
105 Keefer was a very pivotal moment in the records, if you will. It was a symbol of what was going on in the neighborhood more largely.
A lot of folks became involved with Chinatown from 105 Keefer, and I was one of those folks.
105 Keefer, I first heard about when I was at the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Garden. I was on the board there, and the city would send out notices about a rezoning, because that's what it was. They weren't planning to build what was there. They were planning to ask for a rezoning to build higher and bigger and more, right? So this is what developers do. It's part of the profit motive. When we went to public meetings, we could see that it was a very large project that was being proposed and a very small amount of concession being given back for all this additional zoning.
The thing that actually drew everyone's attention to 105 Keefer, I think, was more the new developments at Main and Keefer, the Bosa building and the West Bank building. And when they were torn down and redeveloped and the buildings as they started going up, people kind of started looking around and panicking and saying, like, this is a major change in the landscape and in the community.
You start to see Starbucks come into the community, and you start to see housing prices go up, and now all of a sudden people couldn't afford to live in the community that they grew up in.
At the top of the hill, these tall buildings have really dominated the landscape and really shrunk the heritage buildings and their presence.
At Main and Keefer, it was too late, and we didn't want to see that replicated again. And so everyone turned their attention to 105 Keefer.
When they showed up at the first public meeting with the initial designs, the complete lack of consultation prior to launching that public meeting with the neighborhood stood out like a sore thumb. And so we go to this public meeting, and there is a design. And you're looking at it going, how the hell does this relate to Chinatown? Now, this is not about sticking balconies on the building or putting tile roofs on it or anything like that, but what is it bringing to the neighborhood?
I think 105 Keefer is really special because it is just a parking lot. You know, it is an empty slate that people are able to attach their own sort of affective memory to. When you think about it geographically, it's across from the Chinese Cultural Center and the Sun Yat-sen Gardens. On the other side, there's the Chinatown Plaza, which is outside the Workers' Memorial. But then on the other side, towards Main Street, you are starting to see more hipster cafes and bars. And so this one location is facing pressure from all directions. When you think about the location kind of historically, thinking to the 60s, that's where the freeway was supposed to come and cut through Chinatown. And thinking about the 70s, there were the fire hall fights. And thinking about the early 1900s, it's blocks away from where the Asiatic riots were.
The 1907 riot was because they were at City Hall listening to the American speaker talking about the existential threat posed not by Chinese, but by Sikh sawmill workers who were being chased out of Bellingham and heading towards the Canada border. But of course you lumped Sikhs and Japanese and Chinese into that Asiatic category. And the crowd got riled and they came marching through Chinatown, up Market Alley, and over to the Japanese district.
Essentially, a lot of white supremacists had come marching down to Chinatown and kind of broke a lot of businesses, attacked people in the streets. And this set a lot of discourse for Asian people being violent and stealing jobs and infidelity and opium. And so this kind of set up this initial discourse of what we think of racism in Canada, essentially, because when you think about it, Chinese people legally were not allowed to own land outside of what we now know as Chinatown. It was written in a lot of land clauses.
.105 Keefer was this generation's battle. It was a heritage battle over an empty lot. Now, yes, there had been a gas station there. Yes, there had been a Cantonese theater there before historically, but now it was a parking lot. And so a lot of people were wondering, how do you have a heritage fight over an empty lot? There's no, building there with historical significance. But for me, that actually made it the perfect site for this kind of struggle. It was actually about the future, not the past. That a lot of the people who got involved, they were thinking, what will it mean for Chinatown overall if this becomes 13 stories of condos? But also, what could go into that space instead?
The 105 Keefer proposal was just a development. It really lacked a sense of cultural purpose, and it gave a nod to some space for seniors, but it looked like a sore thumb standing within Chinatown. So I think the development itself had a number of glaring errors, and I think one of the things that they didn't do was work with the community to find its place within this greater community called Chinatown.
They're trying to build a building right next to what has become a de facto war memorial for Chinatown. Remembrance Day ceremonies take place there. It commemorates Chinese veterans.
Chinese Canadians who were able to join and fight for Canada did do it explicitly so that they could demand the franchise. And we use metaphors like struggle and fight. Well, literally, Chinese Canadians fought for the right to vote, and many didn't come back. So Chinatown really was the ground zero for that kind of struggle. It's interesting, the linkage between that fight for the vote and 105 Keefer, because the gas station originally had been owned by a pair of brothers who had fought for Canada and who were part of that struggle, that fight to gain citizenship, to gain the right to vote. And so that's directly linked in the 105 Keefer fight because of the location of that gas station that had been run by two military veterans.
When 105 Keefer was breaking headlines, if you will, the whole city was changing very quickly. Not just Chinatown, but Grandview Woodlands, Marpole, a lot of the largely working class neighborhoods. And 105 Keefer, I think, symbolized the erasure of community and what communities have built over decades, and in Chinatown's case, century. And as the landscape changes and we forget what was there, we get into this amnesia of what was there, who was there, and this slow erasure and displacement of people and their legacies and their contributions.
And what happened was then the protests began to grow. We got together with those who wanted nothing but social housing on that site, but for us, it was more important to talk to all the different people in the Chinatown neighborhood. So all the different societies, those that backed onto this project, those who would have been overshadowed by the project, and of course the garden and the cultural center. And by bringing people together, it was very clear that even if we didn't agree about what should go there, we all agreed what was proposed was not suitable.
Oh, there was most definitely a split in the community. There were a lot of the older organizations that were not business related, but cultural organizations that were supportive of 105 Keefer Street. There were people that have never been involved in Chinatown of Chinese ethnic background that were able to bring their voice out stronger than some of the older groups in Chinatown.
One of the first events where 105 Keefer really became real was there was an open house at I think it was at the Chinese Cultural Center, and they were showing some models of the project. And on the same day, there was a mahjong event with the Youth Collaborative for Chinatown. And after we were done playing mahjong, everybody just walked in a procession around the neighborhood, kind of like at a small protest, all the way to the cultural center.
We really sat around as young people in multiple circles, having multiple meetings here and there with the same people, and we realized that we really need to do something. We couldn't sit around and continue talking about what was being labeled as the death of Chinatown at that time. And we really wanted to change the trajectory of what was going on and change the public dialogue from irrelevant and ancient to a place that people actually value in this city. And so we started, we did an experiment. May 2015, we brought out 12 mahjong tables and sets of tiles and borrowed stools and chairs and promoted on social media and just said, we're doing this hot and noisy mahjong social and come play. There was no strings attached, it was all free, it was public, and we just wanted to see who would show up and whether or not people would show up. And people came out in droves. It really demonstrated that people wanted to be involved and that they cared about the neighborhood and that there was a place where they felt like they belonged. And it changed the dialogue around Chinatown because there was always a question as to whether or not people would come back again, whether or not people would actually visit Chinatown or what for. And we were giving people a reason to do that. And again, the argument for 105 Keefer was that it was going to bring people to the neighborhood, that we needed development in order to support the businesses, that we needed families to come to the neighborhood, and development was going to be the saving grace. And our hot and noisy mahjong socials were to demonstrate that you don't actually need condos in order to do that.
From the city's point of view and from the councillor's point of view, you know, they always approve development projects. It's always about, as long as you check all the boxes, like architecturally you fit the guidelines, you're bringing that many units of social housing, then it's automatically approved. And for once we brought so many people to public hearings that the councillors started feeling pressure. It was actual, you know, young professional people, mostly from a Chinese or Asian Canadian background, who have personal ties to the community.
For so many people who exist on this land who are of Cantonese origin, the existence of Chinatown is a reference point for a lot of them. I think for myself, at least, you know, speaking as somebody who has done a lot of work to understand how much I'm rooted in that history, and my family is rooted in that history, Chinatown's existence means that we understand our identity. If you go to Chinatown, you'll know somebody who knows your great uncle, and that great uncle will know your friend's aunt. It feels like family, and its significance for Vancouver and its history, its activism have impacted Vancouver in immeasurable ways. The reason why we have all of the livable and green and walkable spaces that we do, where we can, you know, move from neighborhood to neighborhood with ease, is because there's no freeway. Vancouver is unique in that way, and it's because of the strength and organizing and will of largely Cantonese folks that we have those things.
The freeway fight for us was about a 6-year fight. The report provided us with 7 options. 6 of them went through Chinatown. So it was really important that Strathcona worked with the Chinatown merchants and societies in order to join together to fight the problem of a freeway running through Chinatown and Strathcona. We also, through the media, worked with the larger community, people who did not believe that Vancouver needed a freeway, that we did not need a third crossing and a waterfront freeway that would then cut through Chinatown, because the east, west, and north-south connectors were going to bisect Chinatown. They talked about, well, we could make it more attractive by hanging baskets from the freeway, but the neighborhoods, you know, underneath the freeway is never a pretty place. And even now, when you walk under the Georgia viaducts, you know how unpleasant that experience can be. We organized the neighborhood block by block, and my mother, who was really a one-person social service agency, all she had to do was go knocking and she was able to get people to respond. And every block we appointed a captain whose job was to go around and talk to their neighbors and get them to come to meetings, get them to come and voice their opinion, and get them to get on the bus to go to City Hall to lobby if that's what we needed to do to get the attention of council. When the community and the federal government together stopped the freeway in 1973, Mr. Robert Andras, who was the minister, said, "I will not support a program that does not have the support of the people most directly affected." So that kind of killed the freeway and got the city to sit down with the neighborhood to negotiate an alternative to urban renewal. However, even when we stopped council approving the freeway proposal, they approved the viaduct. It chopped up our neighborhood for sure. A lot of our warehouses got disrupted and torn down. We had a lot of businesses on Main Street that were replaced with the freeway scale viaducts. And the businesses belonged to Italians and Chinese and Jewish people, all of whom had investments and business in the neighborhood. So we stopped the freeway because we choked off the funding, and still the viaducts were built.
These public hearings were stretching over days and days and days. And of course, you can't have the city government, run like that. We would never get anything done. And yet that said something about how important this was for not just people who are Chinese Canadian, but again, it was like a slice of the city was showing up to these hearings.
For the first 2/3 of Canada's history, it's a very different place. 1967, we finally removed racial preference from our immigration policy, the year I was born. In 1947, we finally allowed Chinese to vote. Up until that moment, all three levels of government used the power of the state to make Chinese second-class citizens. Chinatown was a product of that history, and it reminds us, as no other place can, of who we are.
These last few years, Chinatown has already been dealing with a rapid influx of new residents, new money, and new businesses. We cannot just replace the whole thing and keep calling it Chinatown.
In recent years, we have seen an increase of up to 700 or 800 new units of housing in Chinatown. And my question is, have any of these new units really achieved what was intended? If the residential intensification theory were true, then shouldn't the businesses have been thriving?
We realized that the zoning approved by City Council was not designed to save Chinatown, as we had foolishly thought, but it was effectively designed to replace Chinatown as we knew it. We'd lost the small storefronts, the mom-and-pop businesses, the pedestrian-friendly streets. Now they were shrouded in shadows.
Vancouver Chinatown is a place of cultural, historic, and community significance. A 12-story condominium tower does not belong in Chinatown. Not now, not ever.
The development of the neighborhood was so quick during that time. And I don't think any of us could think of a rezoning application at that time during that council and during that political climate where it was rejected. So the task at hand was monumental for a community that, again, was being labeled as dying, irrelevant, and constantly being erased.
The one thing that Chinatown has and must hold on to with fervor is its culture. So how do we make sure that culture is a thread that holds everything together? And 105 Keefer certainly did not fit the greater cultural imperative.
I do have a really strong sense of nostalgia for Chinatown, but Chinatown can't continue to be the way that it is, and it certainly can't go back to the way that it was. Obviously, things are changing, but we still need to acknowledge that history. And so when you start to see the community become gentrified, you start to see this sense of danger because the people who are currently living there, they're living in these contemporary times too, and it doesn't make sense that, you know, people weren't allowed to live outside of Chinatown, and now people are coming in and they are increasing real estate prices, they're closing local grocers, and these people can no longer afford to live there.
Chinatown isn't where all Chinese Canadians were, but it is this symbolic heart, you could say. And whether it's Victoria Chinatown, Vancouver Chinatown, or other Chinatowns across the country, Vancouver Chinatown in a lot of ways was ground zero for a recurring set of fights for recognition, for fighting against exclusion, fighting against white supremacy. And you could say that we live in a better society now because each generation had its own fight.
Fight was because the empty lots that came from the blocks of housing being demolished within Strathcona, they were demolished and then nothing was built. So the notion was that the city, through the urban renewal plan, bought up the land cheap and then sold it cheap to developers.
So the developer didn't do anything with it. There were some lawsuits and various things, and the city ended up taking the land back by buying it from them. And so then there was promises to the community about a number of amenities and stuff. And then without talking to the community, they decided they were going to drop Fire Hall number 1 on the site instead of the clinic, the dental clinic, medical clinics, and various other things.
The community felt it was the wrong place, and Chinatown really wanted the site to be more housing because that's a place for people to live, a place for the workers to live, and a place for the shoppers to live, right? So we didn't think this was a good location, and we marched together against the building of the fire hall. And we were successful in relocating the fire hall to where it would not adversely affect the school and community.
With 105 Keefer, I think I didn't necessarily know the gravity of the situation until I saw how many people were kind of present and willing to be there. I think it's really important that we acknowledge the unpaid labor that went into 105 Keefer. It's not like people were paid to be there. It's the fact that people within the community, people who don't live in the community, who don't work in the community, that they were willing to come out and speak out against this project, and they saw the severity of the situation.
I remember being so blown away by the kinds of community care that I saw. People were just like, everything in. I'm bringing pizza, I'm bringing snacks, I'm bringing fried rice for the aunties. Everything's here. You know, do you need anything? Are you warm? Are you being taken care of? That's what struck me the most.
You know, you have this David and Goliath kind of scenario. And, you know, David's going up against a developer, which is Goliath, and of course going up against City Council. And of course the community were quite disparate. You have small community groups coming together, even though collectively it was one voice. It certainly did not have the same measure as one large developer.
We felt that clearly whatever zoning was in place, that we also felt a lot of the zoning was wrong, that we'd made a mistake, and that was clear. I mean, I supported the rezoning, thinking this was a way to bring people back to Chinatown, but what we found was condos And Starbucks wasn't going to bring people back to Chinatown. This was the wrong type of development. We needed more shop houses, and we needed more Chinese businesses, and we needed more restaurants again that would attract people back to the area, but also create more jobs. Because a little retailer selling a whole lot of dry goods, you only need one person to man it, but a restaurant needs an army. Right?
When we were doing media things and getting people to write letters to council and everything, the diversity of people that responded was amazing. Diversity in terms of age, of geography. There was a sense that, oh, why would anyone care about Chinatown? And this really showed people care, and not just the Chinese, and not just people who live in Chinatown. It was a very, very broad base of people that were in support of not having this development in the neighborhood.
Chinatown kind of always has been under some sort of threat, and it's always had a history of being under pressure. The barbecue meat fight within Chinatown kind of stands for this other idea of racism. It was sort of this soft form of racism where essentially the government and health officials wanted to get rid of barbecue meats within Chinatown, which, if you know about Chinese culture, it's kind of this almost like ceremonial food that we serve at New Year's or have at funerals or at Qingming. And so the reason why the government wanted to remove barbecue meat shops was that it was deemed unsanitary.
They wanted to insist that we had to store our meat at a higher temperature, which would have dried everything out and made it unpalatable. And the Chinese have been selling this barbecue meat for decades and probably centuries if you think about barbecue meat in Asia. So trying to persuade the health department that it was not a good idea to require that the meat be stored under heat conditions or cold conditions, because that was the other option. Then the fat would congeal and it would not be very tasty, because we like our food fresh and fragrant.
They were freaking out over, oh my God, it's hanging in a window. Oh my God, it's not cooked at this temperature. Vancouver Health Department was the one that came up with the idea that barbecued meats were unhealthy and dangerous. And they managed to convince the Federal Department of Health to put a ban on barbecued meats.
And we took the fight to Parliament. We went to Ottawa. We served barbecue meat in the House of Commons to make sure that they understood that this was an important issue in Vancouver's Chinatown. And of course, it affected Chinatowns all across the country, right? But it got the health department to back off. And so now things are stored to be clean, but it's not going to kill the quality of the food. But again, it's the cultural gap, the failure to accommodate, understand, and accept traditions that have proven itself to be valid, and to accept that we have a wisdom as a culture and as a people that the health department may not have.
What was really interesting and unique about 105 was it brought so many layers of the community together. And the key thing was it galvanized the youth. And when we say youth, that's everything from teenagers right through into the 40-year-olds. But it was an amazing display of activism, community awareness, and bringing together a whole bunch of divergent points of view, but really saying this is not right for Chinatown. Now, they didn't have a perfect answer to what was right for Chinatown, but they knew that this would be really wrong and continue that cycle of, breaking up the neighborhood. And I think what was really interesting was just seeing that interaction and the communication and the really innovative ways that they drew attention to the site and never really let the developer off the hook. And when they went to City Hall They filled City Hall. They had overflow crowds up there. They spoke passionately. They really, didn't yell and scream and sort of make a scene about something as a protest. It was really sharp, on the point arguments about why this was wrong.
That for a lot of the younger people, it was their idea of a respect for their elders, for seniors. And there are over 1,000 Chinese seniors who live in the area. We needed to keep some of that vibrant economy going. Those produce shops, the food industry. That was what people were fighting for, rather than just what people were fighting against.
We spent hours at City Hall and endless delegations. The Chinese youth came out. That was what was really driving this, and it was a way for us seniors, people like myself, and 70 years old, and the young people who came to Chinatown with their grandmothers, and would come down and join the athletic associations and so on, and participate in line dances or kung fu lessons. These people joined with the seniors together to say, we need something different for this site.
The only elders that I'd ever had access to speaking to were my grandparents, and having access to speak to elders at 105 Keefer was very, very beautiful, and they were so fiery, and they were all such powerful matriarchs. They were involved in so many different ways. I mean, they were kind of the spirit of what 105 Keefer was. We were fighting for their livelihoods, and I think for a lot of folks, we were rallying at City Hall to preserve what they brought to Chinatown, because they were the ones who were most affected by this.
We know that many of these kinds of things often exclude, first of all, people who don't speak English. So all the materials are often in English, and so it's not accessible in that way. But even just understanding what a rezoning is. A lot of us had to very quickly learn what all the technical terms of what is a rezoning, what is the process of a rezoning, how are the decisions being made, how to decipher the drawings, what is FSR, all these things. And we were trying to build our own community capacity to even understand and articulate what the problem is and how to talk about it. That's really important for community. And these seniors were really alongside to do this, knowing that the sacrifices and the contributions they made for us to have such a community, it was important that we engage them and that they were involved. The values of Chinatown includes an intergenerational component.
Seniors will jump at any opportunity to be included and to do fun activities with young people. So when the organizers of the Mahjong events invited seniors to join them in protest, many of them jumped at that opportunity to have their voices heard.
They really advocated for themselves and kind of became the glue that held the community together, because historically, these were people who haven't had the platform or the opportunity to vocalize what their concerns for their own community was. So I think 105 Keefer, as kind of crappy as the situation was, it did offer a really great opportunity for there to be system change within the community.
It was so inspiring, because so often you hear about the young people don't care. And if the young people don't care, there is no future for Chinatown. So as someone who's been involved and engaged in Chinatown for 60 years, having the youth take a strong position, take a leadership role, just means so much to me. It just warms my heart and makes me feel that there's a future.
Following along all the media, all the comments from the development board during the 105 Keefer process, although there was a lot of groundswell and activism from the community, it still felt like nothing was going to be different this time. And the feeling during it was, it's like we just need to keep fighting, right? And no one could have guessed what the outcome would have been.
When the first rezoning was rejected, we were astonished. And then they came again. And then it was rejected another time, and another time. And then it went to development permit, and then it was, I mean, I think people were in tears when that one was rejected as well. This became a symbol for community across all of Vancouver, not just Chinatown, of what is possible. It gave people hope that we were able to take a step forward.
It was just a feeling of elation. I mean, I think we all went out afterwards and had a cup of tea or something at Goldstone Bakery or something.
There was much rejoicing, and everybody hugged each other in celebration, and seniors embraced young people, and I felt a sense of achievement I've never had before.
When you go back and read what the now former director of planning said about the building, and his rejection of it was because it did not understand the Chinatown context. It did not involve the sort of what the essence of Chinatown, and it was wrong for the neighborhood.
I think it failed because it brought an outside perspective without dealing with the cultural concerns, and it wasn't sold to the community very well. I think the height was an issue. I think if it was more kind of ground-based, I think it should have gone through. One of the things that is really important is that Chinatown has a balanced community in terms of income levels, rather than continually putting social housing into Chinatown, because it doesn't help the businesses, because you don't have that community base to support the businesses. And that's just the nature of how Chinatown has been throughout its evolution. Seniors make up a big part. They go to play mahjong in the society buildings. But if you can't have a safe street for them to walk on and a community that they can take their friends, then you really haven't done what you need to do to make Chinatown an active community.
Although the rezoning applications and the DP were not successful, the land is still owned on title to the developer, and we don't know what's going to happen.
We're still kind of holding our breath as a community for what's going to happen with that space. There is a city consultation going on right now for the Keefer Memorial, so I think there are rumblings in the community of what's going to happen with that big empty parking lot space right now.
The Keefer 105 fight was important because it was about encroachment. It was a way in which the heritage and the culture of a community could be destroyed, and it was an entry point where you could take that site and turn it into something that enhances and supports Chinatown, or you take it as something that hurts and harms Chinatown. 105 Keefer, if it's done right, can bring in lots of positives for the neighborhood and begin the transformation process.
I think the future of Chinatown could be, very vibrant. I think with so many people so passionate about effecting change for Chinatown, that there's no way it cannot survive at this point. Like, if you asked me that before 105 Keefer, I would have had a very different answer for you.
We have a very large Chinese seniors population here. And so what are the opportunities to provide something that might work for them? There's no one specific, like, that's the perfect building. It's more understanding the neighborhood you're in and working within the confines of that, and not trying to bring something into the neighborhood that you're going to make the neighborhood change.
The future of Chinatown, to me, is always going to be determined by lots of different people who are probably going to disagree about what that future should be. But what's healthy to me is that there's a lot of people who care, and that they're going to spend the time to maybe sit and discuss, disagree, and sometimes agree to disagree too. But it's people who care coming together, and it's a younger generation, and then another younger generation after that. As that generation grows old, that's what to me is a sign of hope. And as a historian, looking back at this recurring, continuous set of struggles, Chinatown is still here because people care about it.
I'm optimistic about Chinatown. I think, especially after 105, as difficult as that process was, it offered a really large opportunity for change, and you did start to see some of those shifts happen. What I'm really optimistic about is the fact that we're starting to see more dialogue amongst different groups who haven't necessarily always talked. You started to see more Indigenous voices. You started to see more Black voices involved in conversations that they had basically been excluded from previously. Especially when you think about, language barriers. It was really difficult to have Chinese elders and folks from other communities in the same room to talk about some of the issues that they're facing. But now you're starting to see an influx in translators and more city-led initiatives that allow for more discourse to happen. I'm really hopeful for that.
There are many competing interests in Chinatown, and that's part of the stalemate and paralysis that prevents it from moving forward. What we're trying to do here in Chinatown is nobody's job. It's not a specific person or group whose job it is to create this successful Chinatown. So if the City of Vancouver or Chinatown were to appoint a person or a body whose mandate it is to create this so-called successful Chinatown and to create this vision, then we would bring the stakeholders together. The way I see it, Chinatown has been in deterioration for 20 years. If we take another 20 years to find our vision for Chinatown, we will not have a Chinatown. I think we need to look at this not in decades, but to look at this in terms of months.
The cultural heritage is a real draw to people back into the neighborhood. It's distinct. It's part of Vancouver and actually Canada's history, and you don't get it in other neighborhoods in the same way. The history is not only in the buildings, but in the people, and you're just part of quite a different vibe than what you get in, Yaletown and Kitsilano or even on Main Street. Chinatown is very real in itself. I think the city needs to be focused on economic recovery and providing capacity for the older legacy businesses so that they can move on to the next generation. At the end of the day, Chinatown is the heart and soul of the Chinese community. You can't go to Richmond and say, hey, this is where it all started.
My business partner had a saying that I think is very appropriate. He said, preservation without development is just as bad as development without preservation. And I think what he meant is that there's a very fine line. We don't want to have no development. Like any other community, there is evolution and change and new people coming in. I mean, it's not a closed community. It never has been, and has always been very welcoming. And I think Chinatown needs to figure out, where does it want to be? What kind of neighborhood do we want to be? And what are the kinds of things that we want to offer? It's not to have consensus, because what community ever has consensus? But if we all contribute and in our own different ways, I think that might be part of the solution.
We need to bring people back, and we need to make sure that this is a clean and welcoming neighborhood with lots of exciting foods. For me, Chinatown is food, right? And food is love. It's all tied together. Since 105 Keefer, that entire process of the community building and the city seeing the response, it really set the stage for a lot of resources finally being put into really looking at Chinatown and the future. The rezoning applications being rejected gave us hope and gave us some breathing room to actually start carving out what do we actually want to see as opposed to what do we not want to see. So we have a team of city staff now who are dedicated on pursuing a UNESCO heritage designation for Chinatown.
There are a lot of different kinds of UNESCO World Heritage Sites around the globe. Some are archaeological sites that are 2,000, 3,000 years old. Others are, temples and things like that. One of the more new versions are actually what are called urban cultural landscapes or urban heritage areas. And these are living communities. And you don't want 100 and 1,000 people a day going to these kinds of sites. This is where people are living. And so there is a real attempt to make sure that there's a managed development as well as a worry that too many visitors is a bad thing.
The idea around the UNESCO World Heritage Site designation is, for it to act as a framework to enable Chinatown to identify and conserve what makes it uniquely special. It talks about intangible cultural heritage, the people, the practices, that feel of the neighborhood, ranging from the sounds of mahjong tiles, Chinese opera singing coming out through the windows of these society buildings, the produce stores and the hawkers there, yelling.
One of the stipulations of that designation is that the community gets to decide what it is. I think that presents the greatest vision and the greatest target for us in Chinatown to aspire to, because it pulls us together, and that is going to not just short-term, but long-term guarantee the success of Chinatown.
A UNESCO designation is not something that should freeze us in amber, but should really help us create a living trust for our citizens and help keep the culture alive and burning, so we don't lose sight of where we came from and where we're going.
It seems like wherever you go in North America, the Chinatown that you eventually find, wherever you are, is always under threat. These old cultural neighborhoods are deteriorating. It almost doesn't matter which city you're talking about. Whether it's poverty creeping in from one side, or gentrification creeping in from the other, Chinatowns have always had to fight outside forces to keep themselves whole. That's why these cultural enclaves have always interested me, and Vancouver's in particular. When I first started researching the events that happened around 105 Keefer, it seemed like it was just another small, helpless community versus the big, bad developer conflict story. But I soon found out that this one was different. The story was a big deal. This time, they wanted to drive a stake into the very heart of Vancouver's Chinatown. And I mean the dead center of Chinatown. This rallied people like no other event ever did. This galvanization is what made this particular story different. As we learned more about how the entire community got together to save their neighborhood, we found out that Vancouver's Chinatown has a history that is littered with these David versus Goliath stories. People living in this place always had to fight for their homes. Chinese immigrants that first came to Canada were ghettoized and were forced to live in Chinatown. They were not allowed to live with quote-unquote regular Canadians. And the people outside of Chinatown treated the neighborhood like a slum at best and a leper colony at worst. They resisted attempt after attempt to raise their neighborhood and to force them out. But this friction created a truly special place, a place where every person from any walk of life was welcome, and people could actually build a home for themselves and their families. But what I found most inspiring was the resilience of Chinatown's residents. Time and time again, they were told their homes were worthless, that who they were and where they lived were not as important as the reality of other Canadians. But they stood their ground. And the fact that Vancouver's Chinatown is still standing when many other neighborhoods have come and gone is a testament to their determination. Clash on Keefer is a documentary that is a small attempt to chronicle their stories of victory and to present their hopes for a better and brighter future for all of Vancouver's people.